How much do you know about transaction costs? Savvy entrepreneurs identify them, calculate them, manage them, and then actively minimize them.
This is Economics for Entrepreneurs, the podcast where we apply the principles of economics to help you start, grow, and manage your business. Here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Let's say you are operating a business and you've incorporated it. You are now the owner, that's an important word as we'll see later, of what the lawyers call a corporation and the economists call a firm. There are lots of advantages to doing this, in addition to the legal protections that are so important. You have a team that is focused entirely on your business mission, and you can share knowledge and learning as you advance together towards your goals. You can manage the team and refocus or redirect its efforts as conditions and the environment change. They'll follow team directions. You can assemble assets and resources and combine them and recombine them because the firm has ownership of them and therefore the right to deploy them in whatever way the team thinks best. You're developing team assets like processes and methods and recipes, and maybe a brand, certainly a reputation and customer trust. The firm is a great vehicle for free market entrepreneurial capitalism and for the creation of consumer value. Interestingly, right here in the idea of the firm, we find a dual stream of thinking between business strategists and economists. The business strategists are always thinking about how to help firms with better strategies, how to better accumulate and utilize knowledge on behalf of customers and consumers, how to innovate more or innovate faster, and how to improve and sharpen strategy. The firm is a vehicle for that. The economists are thinking about strategy too, but they're also thinking about economizing. They see all the benefits of organizing as a firm, and the resource-based strategy we've been talking about for the past few weeks is really a product of economics rather than business school. But in addition, economists think about efficiency as much as effectiveness because profit is revenues minus costs, and it's important to be smart about costs. The economists ask, are there costs to organizing as a firm and to assembling assets and resources, both in terms of physical assets and intangible assets and people assets? It turns out there are costs, and economists label them transaction costs. That's because they are mostly associated with acquiring and owning assets and resources. Broadly speaking, transaction costs are make or buy costs. The resource-based strategy envisions the entrepreneur-owner buying assets and hiring people in support of customer value creation. You want to make the combination of resources as unique as possible and as tuned to your special value creation model as possible. Acquiring those resources is not costless. There are legal costs of contracting, for example. There are costs of vendors trying to extract the highest price possible from you. And once you own them, there are costs of ownership. Your strategy of dynamic flexibility directs you to shuffle and reshuffle those assets in combination as agilely as possible. What if they're not amenable to that? What if the machines that work for you are not easily reprogrammable, or they're out of date for the new purpose you have in mind? What if they are hard to sell at a time when you want to buy new ones to replace them with? These are all costs, frictions if you like, but definitely costs. It's the same with people as with resources. You determine their wage or salary value based on the future stream of consumer value to which you think they can contribute. There are obvious costs on top of that. Benefits, overhead like HR, equipment you have to buy for them to do their jobs, and management costs in general. There might be costs that show up when you want to reshuffle these assets too, whether those are training or retraining costs or exit packages for those you want to reshuffle out of the firm. Buying and owning assets is not costless. So what if you don't own them? Do you avoid all of these costs if you rent machinery and utilize non-employee workers? Is there an organization of the firm that is more efficient as a result of a virtual network of capital and labor assets rather than a hierarchical form of owned assets and employees? In this day and age, the virtual or loosely coupled organization is perfectly feasible. You can rent resources and capabilities and rent people and skills. Is that the more efficient way to go to implement your strategy? Is that the tendency to follow as you design your organization? Today, we're talking to Professor Peter Klein, who is well known to us all. He's professor of entrepreneurship at Baylor University's Hankamer School of Business. He's also senior research fellow at Baylor's Bohr Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. He's an expert in the field of transaction costs and organization. And his book, titled Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment, is definitive in this space. Peter, hello.
Hi, Hunter. It's great to talk to you again.
Well, thank you. Welcome back to Economics for Entrepreneurs. And our goal is to help entrepreneurs do better, as always. And we're going to set the context of today's conversation with a statement from your book, Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment. And the statement is, the entrepreneur's success in experimenting with assets to discover new value-creating attributes depends on internal and external transaction costs. So transaction costs are our subject today. They're clearly, from your statement, very important to the entrepreneur's success. In fact, in your book, you say they're fundamental to the reason for existence of what we call firms. So let's start with a layman's definition of transaction costs and why they're so important to entrepreneurs.
Sure, transaction costs have been part of the conversation in economics for a very long time, but really only in the latter half of the 20th century did people begin studying transaction costs in a systematic way. I mean, what are they? Well, transaction costs are simply the costs of transacting, as the label implies, right? If we think, I want to have a cup of coffee from Starbucks, we normally would ask, well, how much does that cost? Well, I mean, depending on what you get, right? You could pay $4, $5, $6 for a coffee at Starbucks. So, what is the cost of acquiring that coffee for the consumer? Well, it's not just the dollar amount, but it's also the time that you have to take to get to Starbucks. If you're not a regular Starbucks customer and you don't have kind of a go-to drink, right, you might have to sit there and look at the menu and sort of think about it and ask some questions, particularly at Starbucks, because they give funny names to things, tall and grande and venti, and they have all these exotic kinds of flavorings and so forth. So kind of the cognitive burden of figuring out what you want and then waiting for them to deliver it. And, if you have a first name like Peter or Hunter, it's likely that they'll get your name right. But if you have a more unusual name, they might write down the wrong name. You might not hear them when they call you to pick up your drink. So in other words, if we imagine the entire process from starting with me getting in my head the idea that I would like to be drinking, a Starbucks latte or whatever, to the point of me actually putting that drink, to my lips. There's a whole lot of actions and processes that are involved from start to finish. And I have to go through all of those processes and I have to bear some, plenty of costs beyond simply the price of the drink. So the cost of, finding where to get the thing you want, figuring out who has it at the best price, maybe negotiating or haggling with the seller, some double checking to make sure they actually delivered what you requested on time and that it's the right thing, maybe haggling with them afterwards if there's some kind of a problem. From the consumer's point of view, these are all costs of transacting. And of course, from a business person's point of view, who's buying wholesale products and dealing with workers as well as customers and so forth, you can imagine that the costs of transacting can be pretty significant.
Yeah, and so I see that. Isn't also, if I understand it right from your book, there are costs of ownership after I've done all of that buying and transacting that you've just described. There are costs when I own those assets or I've got that person employed, and there might also be some costs of exiting from those assets. Are those all included in transaction costs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of a broad label, an umbrella term under which a variety of different kinds of costs associating with buying and selling, with producing, with monitoring, managing, and so forth, fit. And just to continue with our coffee example, like I imagine you and most of our listeners, I have a coffee machine at home. It's not a super high-end machine, but it's a pretty good one. And I might choose to make my latte at home, right? And so many people think, oh, well, obviously, if you do this thing yourself, right, you sort of bring this transaction inside the organization, make your coffee at home rather than do it at Starbucks. That must be cheaper. That must be better. Well, I mean, yes and no, right? It depends on my cost to acquire that machine. Maybe that machine requires some maintenance. Obviously, I've got to buy supplies. I've got to buy coffee or coffee grounds or coffee pods or whatever I use. I might have to get the machine repaired. If it's a really complicated machine and I have an assistant who comes to my house and operates the machine, I've got to hire that person and deal with all the HR issues associated with that employee. And of course, simply the amount of time to get the beans and put them in the grinder and put the grounds into the machine and turn the machine on and so forth. I mean, once you add all of that up, I might find that it's more effective, more efficient, and even less expensive for me to just walk down the street to the coffee shop. So all of those costs associated with doing things beyond simply the sticker price that we pay for materials or the dollar amount we pay in wages to employees, all of those things fit under this broad category of costs of transacting or transaction costs.
Yeah. So one summary of transaction costs that you could see in the literature is it's a make or buy decision for the entrepreneur. Should this be in-house or should I subcontract it? Or you might say rent or own, or you might say
Sure.
in-source versus outsource. Is that a good way to characterize them?
Absolutely. I would say that's one of the major issues that thinking about transaction costs can illuminate, right? And in the quotation from my book that you used to open the show, you read about distinguishing external and internal transaction costs. And
Yeah.
all that means, right? External transaction costs are the costs of doing business, the cost of exchange and negotiation and so forth, between firms or between individuals and other individuals and other firms. Internal transaction costs refer to the sort of costs of organizing things inside a firm or inside a household, managing, monitoring, and so forth. So just to stick with our coffee example, I mean, should I buy my coffee at the store or should I make it inside? I mean, if we just had sort of naive kind of cost accounting data, well, how much do I pay per pound for coffee beans? How much do I pay for pods, whatever I use? What's the cost of the electricity and so forth? And I compare that to the sticker price of a coffee cup. That's not going to give me a complete picture of whether it makes more sense for me to make my coffee at home or buy my coffee at the store, assuming that the quality of the beverage, from my consumption point of view, is roughly equivalent. Really, what I want to take into account is all of the costs, external and internal. How long does it take me to get to the store? How much time do I have to spend thinking about it? What happens if it goes wrong and they give me the wrong drink? I need to consider all of those costs as part of the cost of acquiring that beverage externally, outside of my household or my organization, my firm. I want to compare, and I also want to take into account the cost of producing the coffee internally. Again, not just what I paid for the beans, but how much time it takes me to do it, what my time is worth, if there's some management or maintenance or monitoring, if I have an assistant or I ask my spouse to make the coffee. Well, what if my spouse doesn't make the right kind of coffee, and then there might be some marital conflict in the house? But all of those things should be taken into consideration in deciding whether it's better to make your coffee inside or outside. So transaction cost thinking is really just a way of broadening and making more complete the full set of costs and benefits that decision makers should take into account when they're deciding, for example, should I outsource something or should I make it myself?
Yep. Okay, good. That's a good place to start from, I think. This rent or own or make or buy. So we're talking about transactions that involve uh, capital assets, resources like employees, and any other resources like the ones we've been talking about in recent weeks. And I found another organizing rubric in your book of three kinds of transaction costs, and you called them monitoring costs, the property rights once you own the asset or the resource, and then costs after you've contracted, the cost of incomplete contract. So let's use those three designations, but they're not entirely clear. So let's dig into them. So the monitoring costs seem to be relating to getting the performance you want out of the asset or the resource that you've added to your firm. Is that right?
That's exactly right. We could also include the cost of monitoring external partners as well. So whether it's an internalized transaction or an externalized one, for example, think about a large retailer like Walmart. Walmart owns its own. Walmart has a fleet of trucks of 18-wheelers that bring goods and services from the Walmart distribution centers out to the Walmart stores. And Walmart, in fact, owns most of those trucks, not all of them, but those trucks, those assets are owned by Walmart and the drivers are Walmart employees, right? You can imagine another kind of retail or a smaller retail, even some larger ones. Look at Amazon, right? Amazon, at least at present, delivers most of its goods and services to the consumer via FedEx or UPS or the Postal Service. I guess they have a few Amazon drones, and maybe someday it will be a fleet of Amazon drones or Amazon self-driving cars. But at the moment, Amazon has chosen to outsource much of its sort of delivery function. So if we think about the cost of monitoring those two different types of transactions for Walmart, the monitoring costs involve hiring the drivers and training the drivers, and then some way of tracking where the drivers are and making sure that they stay on route and seeing who is, some kind of productivity measure for different drivers, looking at the skills of drivers and so forth. That I might also include monitoring the mechanics and people who service the vehicles and so forth. So dealing with all of the employees and monitoring the health of the physical capital of things that you own, where your own employees are managing those resources. Those are monitoring costs that must be taken into account. And if you use the external model, right, you've got to monitor the pickups and the deliveries, and that's why all of us as consumers, when we order something to be delivered, we want to get an email with confirmation with that tracking number. So we can go to FedEx.com or UPS.com or DHL.com or whatever. We can enter that tracking number. We can find out where is my package, right? So monitoring an external partner, an independent contractor, or some kind of arm's length supplier or distributor, that's another kind of monitoring. So monitoring really refers to making sure that the arrangements that you have made are actually, being implemented or are working out the way that you intended.
And that sounds to me, Peter, like it's um, a cost of management that the entrepreneur has to devote time to supervisory management or hiring supervisory overhead, or, as you say, people to monitor and track performance, spend valuable time on monitoring. And that time is not value creation time. And so it's a transaction cost. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, and many entrepreneurs, many founders who are creative people and who are thinking about value creation and so forth, they can get very frustrated with this aspect of operating a business, right? So you think, oh gosh, I've got this wonderful business model, I've got this technology, whatever it is. I imagine consumers using it in these ways in the future, and the revenues just sort of rolling in. Well, yeah, I recognize I've got to hire, I've got a few people on my team, and I've got to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do, but I don't want to have to deal with that. Management is not a very glamorous, that's not a sexy or exciting activity the way that innovating and entrepreneuring, the way most people think of that term, is. So I think one of the challenges for entrepreneurs, and here I mean entrepreneurs in the sense that we discuss entrepreneurs on this show, meaning people not only who have good ideas, but people who put their ideas into practice
Right.
commercially, they need to recognize that managing and other kinds of monitoring and supervising transactions, I mean, that's part of the game. And that's really inevitable no matter how much of a kind of a distant manager you want to be.
Right. Peter, I'd just like to cut away for a second. I'm just going to take this moment to remind listeners they can find all of our Economics for Entrepreneurs podcasts at mises.org slash E4E pod. That's the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, POD. And they can engage with you and me and other podcast guests and other members of the Economics for Entrepreneurs team on our LinkedIn group page. Type in mises.business/group. That's mises.business/group. Send us questions, make comments, ask us anything you want. We'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. And now back to our conversation. Also, there's an opportunity for entrepreneurship in managing transaction costs. I came across a company called Git Prime that monitors the productivity of an engineering team in India that you might have hired because you're in the US and you wanted to outsource your software engineering. And it's very hard to monitor those folks in India and uh, how good is the code they're producing and how productive are they compared to the people in Estonia or the people in Indianapolis. And the software tracks that productivity and how much code is being produced and how much technical debt is being incurred and so on. So some entrepreneur who started Git Prime has figured out there's a value in monitoring transaction costs. So
Absolutely. And, Hunter, we need to remember that uh, value, right? Value is, benefit as perceived subjectively by consumers and expressed monetarily in their willingness to pay, minus the cost, the opportunity costs of the resources, human and physical resources that are involved. So, a very important way to create value is to reduce costs even if the product or service being delivered is no different from the one that was produced and delivered before. I mean, that is reducing transaction costs is a form of value creation. We don't always recognize it as such, but everyone can see if you look at, online marketplaces like Alibaba or think about eBay in the early days. You and I are both old enough to remember when eBay was a young company, and most of the goods and services being sold or the goods being exchanged on eBay were, all kinds of sort of weird secondhand flea market items, right? The way that eBay created tremendous amounts of value to consumers was not in sort of offering for sale goods, particular products that had never been bought and sold before, right? It was the same kind of knickknacks and obscure items and so forth that people had been buying at flea markets forever. But eBay made it much, much easier for buyers and sellers to find each other and to engage in sort of anonymous arm's length but trustworthy exchange of money for a promise of delivery and uh, to track the exchange and so forth. So firms like eBay are transaction cost innovators. They
mhm.
create value by reducing transaction costs. And so even if you're not producing a different product or a different service, an entrepreneur can be very successful and can benefit all of humanity by coming up with new and exciting ways to make all different kinds of transaction costs smaller.
Yeah, yeah, we'll hold on to that definition, a transaction cost innovator. I'll give you another example of a piece of data that I think is relevant to transaction costs. There's been some studies in launching um, complex new software products about the cost of delay. And one datum that I remember is a 4-month delay in planned launch
Mm,
can cost you as much as 33% of the future revenue streams, or profit streams, I should say, future profit streams that you would have received if you didn't have the delay. And that's because of competitors catching up or customers doing something else instead of using your software. So that's a transaction cost. It's a cost of delay or a cost of time or a cost of you didn't monitor it well or something. But certainly there's money being placed on that transaction cost bet.
Oh, I agree absolutely. I think getting the timing right can be important. That is an important part of transacting. You're figuring out better ways to time the market or to coordinate with other parties. That's all. I would include those as part of the transaction cost discussion as well.
Yeah. So our second category, we talked about monitoring costs, and we may have overlapped into this, but the idea of property rights. I've acquired an asset. I've contracted with an employee of a service provider, and there's this concept of in the literature it's called incomplete or imperfect contracts. That is, you can never cover every contingency or possibility when you make the transaction, and you may want to adjust it, and that might be hard. Tell us about the second category of property right transaction costs.
Yeah, sure. So, we're all familiar with the idea that when we have valuable resources, we need to invest some additional resources in, sort of protecting them, right? I mean, you have a lock on your door, you have maybe some kind of security system, um, people operating businesses in parts of the world that don't have a very effective legal system or don't have strong formal property rights protection, right? Have to put into their budget private security or maybe paying bribes to local officials, right? So let me put it another way. The most obvious way we think about transaction costs is the cost of exchanging property rights that are already very well defined and enforced, right? I pay money and I get the coffee beans delivered by mail or whatever. But there are also costs associating with identifying who owns what, protecting people's property rights, establishing sort of the legal boundaries and definitions of exactly, who can use a resource or an asset in a particular way under particular circumstances. So you can think of those as maybe contracting costs or property protection costs. And those are also things that can be a very important part of the entrepreneur's income statement, but can be easily overlooked. You mentioned the idea of contractual completeness, right? So you can imagine a very simple kind of exchange where it's very obvious how the exchange will take place. There's very little that could go wrong. We can write a very simple contract. You deliver my coffee beans to my house on the first of the month, and I'll pay you, so many dollars on this sort of payment schedule. That doesn't require a very complicated legal document, right? A paragraph or maybe a one-page sort of a thing. But as we know, many complex transactions have much more detailed and complicated uh, sort of contractual protections. I mean, it's sort of a joke, obviously, in the software and IT world that I shouldn't say a joke, but it's much commented on that we're constantly signing these click-through licenses every time we install a piece of software. We go onto a certain website, and how many people click the little button for "Show me the complete terms of this contract." No, it's like I want to install this thing now. Install. Yes, I accept. I accept. You have no idea what kind of terms and conditions you're agreeing to. But if you actually look at the terms of service of a lot of these things that you sign, I mean, they can be extremely lengthy and complicated. Why? Because the contracting parties, or more realistically, the party on the other side of that contract, can imagine a whole range of maybe not very likely, but conceivable circumstances or contingencies, and wants to impose particular obligations on either or both parties in the event that some of those contingencies arise. But in a world of uncertainty, and on one of your previous podcasts, we had a great discussion of the reality of sort of pervasive and deep uncertainty. Uh, we can't anticipate every contingency that could possibly arise. So almost all formal arrangements for protecting property or exchanging property, they have some gaps, they have some holes or some gaps. And so part of the cost of doing business, right, is figuring out what happens in a circumstance where this event was not considered and was not provided for in the contract, or there's some kind of a dispute among the contracting parties about what really happened and how the language of the contract should be interpreted. So here we're talking about costs of using the legal system, or maybe extra legal means of protecting property. I guess the mafia has its own kind of enforcement system that, again, it's costly, whether you use the formal legal system, whether you use informal arrangements. The cost of sort of defining and enforcing agreements and figuring out what to do in cases where the agreement was incomplete is another form of transaction costs, and one that in many cases can be super, super important.
One of the places where it seems that that issue can arise is uh, a part of Austrian capital theory that we were talking with Per Byland recently, and you write about in your book, which is entrepreneurs want to reshuffle their assets. They find new feedback from the marketplace. They want to change the way they do things. You call it experimenting,
Right.
the experimenting to find new attributes for the assets they already own. And there might be transaction costs in that. It might be hard to do that, whether it's contractual or it's just, hey, the asset I've got doesn't do what I now want it to do. Is that a particular kind of transaction cost, this reshuffling and experimenting?
Sure. Or I think you could say reshuffling or experimenting is more costly when the various kinds of transaction costs we're talking about are high, right? I mean,
Hmm.
if these are very idiosyncratic resources, and experimenting literally means purchasing some of these resources from other owners, trying them out in various combinations with other resources that I have, then selling off the ones that I no longer want. I mean, if the markets in which I buy and sell those assets are characterized by high transaction costs, maybe there aren't very many people who have them or many people who want them. It's not a straightforward transaction. There's a lot of haggling or negotiating involved in pricing and other terms. The exchanges are not very well defined by the legal system, and we need all kinds of complicated, legal arrangements. Then the higher those costs, the more costly it will be for me to perform this kind of experimentation, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why entrepreneurship tends to flourish in societies that do have a well defined legal system, that have well functioning asset markets, including capital markets, financial markets, in which labor markets are relatively free and open. There are lots of parts of the developed world in Western Europe, for example, where labor law operates very differently than it does in the Anglo-American world. Where workers have much longer and sort of stronger contractual protections against employment termination. Right. So it's difficult. It's more difficult for an entrepreneur in France, let's say, to experiment with different combinations of different sort of work teams, right? I want to see if combining these kinds of skills within my work team work well compared to combining some other kinds of skills. Well, when it's very difficult to sort of hire and fire employees for legal reasons, then those kind of experiments are much more costly to perform. Think about places where the legal system makes it very difficult to shut down underperforming plants or branches, right, because of concern about employment effects in those communities or whatever. I mean, if entrepreneurs are required to stick with their existing capital structure or an existing set of labor market arrangements because it's not legal to build things and then tear them down or whatever,
Right.
that makes it much more costly for the kind of experimentation we're talking about to take place, which probably has something to do with slower rates of economic growth in those kinds of countries.
Yeah. Our old style union contracts where a person who turned a screwdriver wasn't allowed
Yeah,
to use a hammer.
absolutely. And by the way, I'm not, if I were an employee, I would love to have the kind of job security that some of those contracts can provide. But from the point of view of the efficiency of the economic system as a whole, we typically entrepreneurs typically like factor markets that are more sort of open and fluid. Now, having said that, just let me add an important caveat, because this comes up often in discussions about the monetary system and business cycles and so forth. Well, I'm not saying that all contracts for the rental services of resources, whether it be buildings, land, machines, and labor, should always be, spot contracts, very short term, that there should be no long-term leasing arrangements or long-term labor contracts. I'm not saying that at all. That's something that the entrepreneurs and the owners of land or capital, between entrepreneurs and the workers who will be loaning their services to the entrepreneur, can work out right amongst themselves. So entrepreneurs may find that it's better to offer people job security, or to offer some of their workers job security, because that gives those workers more of an incentive to invest in developing skills and knowledge that are useful for a particular project. That's great. All I'm saying is it should be up to market participants, entrepreneurs and potential workers, entrepreneurs and resource owners who might want to rent or sell to the entrepreneur, to sort of decide whether the benefits of flexibility in terms of facilitating experimentation outweigh the benefits from having, more stability and so forth. That's going to vary case by case. I'm just saying, if regulation or policy externally imposes a particular structure, contractual structure, on entrepreneurs and their partners, that's just going to cut off some options that might otherwise be preferred.
Right. No, understood. And we will talk about the new kinds of capital light companies and virtual firms and virtual capital in a second. But let's just see if we can help entrepreneurs by pulling together these three kinds of transaction costs. And is there a single perspective if I'm an entrepreneur, Peter? Can I, when I'm thinking about my business, thinking about planning for the future, thinking about assembling up my resources, is there a way to think about transaction costs as an element of that managerial job, the part you said you hate but you have to do?
Yeah.
Is there a best approach to think about transaction costs?
Right. Well, I think what the entrepreneur wants to do in this case, as in lots of cases of entrepreneurial decision making, as we've discussed on the show before, is, to be very careful in thinking through alternative scenarios, right? And properly accounting for the most likely best estimates of benefits and costs from each scenario. Remember, from the perspective of Austrian economics, uh, human action, as Mises puts it, is always about choosing among competing alternatives, right? So again, it's like my make or buy example with the coffee, or a retailer or wholesaler's decision to use its own delivery vehicles versus contracting those out to a private shipping company or whatever. I think the entrepreneur should always try to think through as many possible alternative ways of organizing this particular, you know, business model or good or service, and then do it as completely as possible, an analysis of all the benefits and costs, including transaction costs of each alternatives. And my sense is, from studying entrepreneurs and talking to many entrepreneurs and working with entrepreneurs tend to understand this mindset when they're thinking about alternative goods and services, or alternative, production technologies, right? So there are three possible, or whatever. If I'm in the software industry, I have several possible versions of my product that I can imagine being able to produce, and I'm very good at thinking through the different feature sets that I want, and the different, what kind of programmers I want to use, and so forth. But when it comes time to thinking through the transaction costs of, alternative ways to monitor my employees, alternative ways to write contracts for things, then entrepreneurs tend not to be as good. They lapse back into a way of thinking of, oh, well, none of that stuff matters, right? All that matters is the
Yeah.
code. All that matters is the label that's on my product. All that matters is, my marketing strategy. And all I would add is that entrepreneurs should also, for a given business model, right, for a given particular product or service and a marketing strategy and so forth, they then want to think about alternative transactional modes or alternative organizational modes for producing or delivering this value to the market. And it may be that what seems like the most obvious way to do it, once transaction costs are taken into account, is in fact not the most obvious way to do it. Simple example, since you mentioned this earlier, is a lot of internet entrepreneurs or startup entrepreneurs imagine that it's best to just outsource everything other than the kind of core idea. I want to outsource the purchasing. I want to outsource all the delivery. I want my workers to be if I'm in the US or Europe, I want my workers, programmers to be in India. I want as little overhead as possible. I want the leanest, most outsourced, most virtual kind of organization that I can possibly have. But that isn't always the transaction cost efficient means of production, as many entrepreneurs have found out, because monitoring and managing all those things outside of your sort of immediate vicinity is not easy. Many things can go wrong, and sometimes it's actually better to insource some of those functions rather than believe that everything should be outsourced.
Yeah. So you got to think through the transaction costs of both kinds of firms, the virtual firm and the asset heavy firm. So the capital markets, Peter, today seem to be assigning high value to companies that don't have a lot of fixed asset ownership and maybe not a lot of direct employees, but they've got revenue generating intangible assets like brands and
Right.
subscriber bases and IP and so on. So another part of that question is, in contrast to what you just said, isn't this virtual or hybrid kind of organization owning a few assets but renting most of them or operating them as variable cost items? Isn't that becoming more popular? And is some of that because they have lower transaction costs?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, the answer is, as is often the case, kind of yes and no, right? So we certainly see a lot of high profile examples, right? High valuation companies that don't own a lot of assets, right? Uber doesn't own taxis. Netflix until recently didn't own any production facilities. Now they're producing more original content. Airbnb doesn't own buildings and so forth. So we've seen very high market capitalizations of a lot of these sort of high profile firms that are more organized, more like virtual firms. They run the platform but they don't own the physical assets. They don't hire the services are not performed by hired employees and so forth. So first point is that is definitely true. There are lots of very interesting examples, but it's not obvious if you look kind of economy wide that there's a general trend in that direction. That just really doesn't apply to most enterprises in most sectors of the economy. It only really applies to a few. So we don't have good systematic economy wide evidence that this is happening in general. It's just happening in many sort of high profile cases. Now, a lot of people think, but surely that should be happening because as in an example that we just discussed, it's pretty easy for me to set up my own business. I could, you and I can create one in the next hour, and we just have to complete a couple of forms, and we set up our website, and maybe we register a brand, and we can start buying raw materials in China or having our manufacturing done in China, and then we can use PayPal or Bitcoin, as our payment processor, and we can use FedEx and UPS as our delivery mechanism and so forth. We can kind of create a virtual firm very easily. So shouldn't everybody be doing that? The problem is that that kind of conclusion follows, I think, from looking only at one side of the equation. Right. So it is obviously true that the internet and better software and mobile telephony and cheap network access and so forth facilitates transactions between companies, between firms, or between entrepreneurs and independent contractors and resource owners. So the external transaction costs, the cost of transacting between firms, certainly have fallen as a result of information technology. But on the flip side, many of the costs associated with monitoring or managing resources that you own or employees that you employ have also gone down, right? So anybody who works in a large organization is aware of the potential value of various kinds of ERP systems. And I mean, just think about not only email, but apps like Slack and so forth that are not only used to coordinate among independent partners, but are also used to coordinate among groups inside companies, right? So supervisors can monitor their employees much more easily using software and mobile devices and so forth than they could in the old days. Internal manufacturing processes can be made much more efficient, much more automated. A lot of the HR function is much easier than it was before, not only because we have platforms and online services for finding employees, but also because we can monitor what our employees are doing in a way that's very effective. I work for a university. I work for a large university with 5 or 6 thousand employees, and a lot of my time is spent right reporting on what I'm doing to my department chair or my dean. And in the old days, when I first started out, there was a lot of paperwork, literal paperwork, and there were a lot of face-to-face meetings to sort of go over who's doing what. Nowadays, I spend much less time on those kinds of activities because Google Scholar picks up most of my academic publications. When what classes I've taught, that's all in a big ERP system. My students do evaluations of the professor, right? My teaching evaluation scores, the grade distributions that I assigned in my classes, all of that stuff is available to my supervisor with 1 or 2 mouse clicks. I don't have to compile that information and send it forward. How productive is my research career? My dean can find that out in just a few seconds by going to the right websites. And so my point is information technology has not only made it easier to deal with independent contractors, it's also made it easier to deal with employees. How those different effects balance, which one outweighs the other, well, that really depends on the circumstances and it varies from case to case.
Yep. But that's a great point. And the other thing I'm taking away here today, Peter, is that this transaction cost of monitoring and managing and everything we've talked about, it's not just the assets and resources that you own, it's the ones that you control in the economic sense of being able to manipulate them and experiment with them, as you say in the book, to produce value. It's the cost of that control, whether you own it or not. You need to control it.
Yeah, that's right. Another cost of outsourcing is that I may have an agreement with my outsourced provider or partner, a contract that is fairly straightforward and simple, but not very flexible, right? So if I want to make changes on the fly, I've got to go back to my independent contractors. I've got to go back to my landlord. I've got to go back to the owner of the machines that I'm renting and kind of sort of renegotiate those details every time I want to make a change and under conditions of high uncertainty. Or if I have a business model that involves a lot of experimentation, going back and renegotiating every time can be very costly. So one advantage of me maintaining more closer control, owning the land, buying the building, owning the machines, hiring the employees full time rather than using them as independent contractors, is that I can make these changes on the fly without having to renegotiate, without having to explain everything. I think a useful way to think about this from an HR perspective is that look, I mean, everybody owns his or her own labor, whether you work as an employee or as an independent contractor. But the difference between most independent contractor arrangements and most employment contracts is that the former are much more specific and the latter are much more open ended, right? If you hire me, Hunter, to be your personal assistant or your research assistant or your collaborator on this podcast, it's a pretty open-ended deal. Maybe it specifies hours of employment and it specifies pay and there's some other conditions. But what I will actually do on a day-to-day basis when I show up at your office or we connect on Skype or whatever, that's kind of up to you. I mean, it's sort of open. My job is to do what you tell me to do within some limits that are established by the contract. Whereas with an independent contractor arrangement, you hire me to perform a much more specific task with many more restrictions on what each of us can do. Now, which is better? Well, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages of each. But I think many entrepreneurs have found that in highly complex and uncertain environments, they actually prefer to work with employees with more open-ended kind of arrangements than to have everything outsourced where you've got to go back and renegotiate every time you want to make a change.
Right. Good. That's a good perspective. We're running up against the clock here, Peter. So we try to identify a kind of single actionable insight out of our conversations. So I'm going to see if we can do that briefly now. And what I've come up with from what you've said, I'm just repeating what you said, that entrepreneurs need to be transaction cost innovators. And that has two parts. One is to identify your transaction costs, and we've tried to identify some of them today, and then figure out the alternative choices as to which ones you accept and which ones you can reduce. How about that?
Hunter, I think that's terrific, although I might state it a little bit differently. Maybe we could say that entrepreneurs need to be transaction cost savvy or transaction cost aware, right? They need to be sure that they're taking transaction costs into consideration when they make their decisions. I believe that you've had my colleague Per Bieland on several times, in one case to talk about the basic idea of opportunity cost, right? And so if entrepreneurs don't understand that opportunity cost thinking is the right way to think about costs, they can make mistakes. I would say likewise, entrepreneurs need to be aware of the transaction costs of alternative courses of action and be sure that they're taking those into consideration when they make their decisions.
Good. That's perfect. I'm going to have one last question for you, and that is, have you ever seen a list of transaction costs? Is there a Wikipedia for transaction costs that would help our entrepreneurs?
So that's a great question. I have not looked to see what Wikipedia says about transaction costs, but I will do so as soon as we.
It doesn't give a list. I checked.
Yeah. Okay. It doesn't give a list. I can recommend a couple of articles that maybe we could link to from the site that are designed to provide kind of a high level overview of the sort of things that we're talking about. I don't know that we want to try to come up with an exact list of 10 or 25 or 30 items because the market might be discovering new forms of transaction costs all the time. But I'll suggest I'll send you some materials that you can link to that may be useful for our listeners who want to go a little bit deeper or get something in writing to sort of back up the conversation that we're having.
Okay, good. We'll appreciate that. My tongue was slightly in my cheek there, Peter.
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you. This is hopefully another area where we can help entrepreneurs with their thinking, and as you say, we can help them to be transaction cost savvy. So, Peter, thank you very much.
Thanks, Hunter. It's always a pleasure.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.